So my name is Scott Masters. I'm a high school teacher at Crestwood Preparatory College in Toronto. I've been teaching here and elsewhere for about 30 years now, and right now I happen to be the history department chair, and I've been running a program here called the Oral History Project for a number of years. I'm originally from this area in Ontario, and I lived in the United States for quite a while too.
My name is Ronnie Wan. My first year in Canada was 2003. I graduated from Bambu College in 2007, and I graduated from University of Waterloo in 2012. I work at Crestwood Preparatory College in Toronto. I'm a teacher, and I do a lot of robotics, a lot of computers.
So Remembrance Day is celebrated on November the 11th, and it's a holiday that dates back to the end of the First World War. The armistice was signed on November the 11th at 11 a.m., and many countries connected to the war have since recognized November 11th as a national holiday. Some countries call it Armistice Day. In the US, they call it Veterans Day. We call it Remembrance Day here. And even though it began connected to the First World War, it has turned into an important day of remembrance for Canadian veterans who were involved in, the many battlefields in which Canada has fought. It's also an important day for Canadians to be able to look at the role they've played in peacekeeping operations through the United Nations and so forth. Basically a day for Canadians to pause and reflect and think a little bit about their military history, but more to think about the sacrifices that individual Canadians have made. I always get worried that a lot of people think Remembrance Day is about glorifying war or really focusing on the military, and that's not what it's about. It's about remembering the Canadians who did what they had to do when they were asked to.
When I was back in Hong Kong, I had no idea about it's not a thing in Hong Kong, or at least I didn't know it was a thing. And when I came to Canada, when I was in high school, you sit in an assembly, it never really hit me about what it really was. We just thought, okay, let's sit here for an hour and listen to someone talk. And didn't really get it. And English was a bit of a challenge for me when I was, first starting in Canada, just like most immigrants. But when I was teaching in a different school, I was actually helping to train cadets when I was in that school. And Remembrance Day was always a big thing. We did a lot of demonstration. We did some marching. It was a whole big thing. And definitely that's when I realized what Remembrance Day was, and I started reading up on it and realized the role that Chinese citizens, their role in the First World War, and the whole thing of how Remembrance Day came to be.
I mean, as a history teacher, I definitely think about that deep meaning of what it means for the whole community. But personally, I very much think about my own grandparents. I always talk about them in history class. I happen to have one grandfather who was a veteran of the First World War. He was quite old, and he lived to be 105. So when I was growing up, I would always talk with him, and he would share some of his stories about the war, and I have a lot of his old photographs. And I always tell my students about that. My students, of course, don't get to meet people who were in the First World War. Nobody does anymore. They're all gone. So it's a day for me to think about what he went through, which was really awful, and to think about my other grandfather, who was a naval veteran during World War II. Both of those men, had to put their lives on hold for 3 and 4 years while Canada was involved in this conflict, and they had to sacrifice a lot. So personally, I think a little bit about them, and I think all Canadians, people in Canada, have a similar kind of memory that they can look back on. So this is I always have my students do a project related to Remembrance Day. This is one that a student came up with. I thought it was a really cool original idea, looking at how World War I transpired. So he ended up doing sort of a series of pop-up art, looking at the start of the war, looking at the Battle of Vimy Ridge, which is probably the best known of the Canadian battles, and looking at the Wartime Elections Act and the Canadian Prime Minister, Robert Borden, and of course looking at the cemeteries that are such an unfortunate but such a powerful part of what Remembrance Day is all about. He told me he didn't get any sleep last night because he was busy putting this thing together, and I think he did a fantastic job. It's really good and really original, and I think it's it's a great way for a student to show what the day means to him.
A lot of people will say like veterans. I personally don't know a lot of veterans, but I do think that it is. I need to give the shout out to everybody who works their butt off to try and keep this tradition going. As you know, as the year goes on, like when you're passing on, like for example, Mr. Master does the oral history project. One of the biggest reasons why he does it is because people forget things. As people pass away and people, as the population cycle through, we lose stories, right? And people like Mr. Masters and having all the people put all that effort into passing the stories on to the future generation. In my opinion, they deserve a huge shout out. On top of obviously the things that you talk about during Remembrance Day, such as the veterans, people that gave their life to the wars and everything. But overall, I feel that people that are trying to keep those stories alive definitely deserves a huge shout out for all their work, because 10-20 years from now, the stories are going to be more and more diminished, right? You want to make sure that you have all those things recorded, and so that for future generations to remember why that is such a big deal, instead of letting it go by the wayside as time goes on. So.